The International Osteoporosis Foundation published a landmark global review of vitamin D status in 2009, synthesizing data from dozens of population studies across North America, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. The finding that applied most directly to adults in English-speaking Tier 1 countries was stark: vitamin D deficiency and insufficiency were not rare edge cases. They were the norm in populations in northern latitudes, particularly in winter months, and particularly in adults over 55. 40% of U.S. adults over 50 had circulating 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels below 20 nanograms per milliliter at some point in the year, which is the threshold most clinical guidelines use to define deficiency. In Scandinavia and Northern Europe, the figure during winter months exceeded 60%. These are people walking into physician appointments with results, diets, and supplement habits that are not preventing measurable deficiency. In this video, what 25-hydroxyvitamin D actually measures and what the clinical thresholds mean, why the dose response between sun exposure and vitamin D synthesis changes fundamentally after the age of 55, the specific factors that modify how much vitamin D you produce from a given amount of sun, the limitations of both sun-based and supplemental approaches, and 3 takeaways grounded in the current evidence. Quick note before we continue: this is educational content based on published research, not medical advice. Talk to your physician before changing your regimen. Now, the evidence. Vitamin D is not a conventional vitamin in the dietary sense. It is a corticosteroid hormone precursor that the body synthesizes in skin exposed to ultraviolet B radiation from sunlight, and that requires 2 metabolic activation steps, one in the liver, one in the kidneys, to become the biologically active form, calcitriol. The circulating form measured in blood tests, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, or 25-OH-D, is the principal storage and transport form and the standard marker of vitamin D status in clinical practice. The reasons it matters in older adults are well established. Vitamin D is essential for calcium absorption in the gut, bone mineralization, immune function, neuromuscular function, and has been associated in observational studies with a range of outcomes including cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes risk, and cognitive function. What are the clinical thresholds? The definition of deficiency varies somewhat between guidelines. The Endocrine Society defines deficiency as below 20 nanograms per milliliter and sufficiency as above 30 nanograms per milliliter. The Institute of Medicine used 20 nanograms per milliliter as the threshold for adequacy for bone health. Some researchers and clinicians use higher optimal targets, above 40 or even 50 nanograms per milliliter, based on observational data, but these higher targets are not endorsed by most major guidelines, and the evidence for benefit above 30 to 40 nanograms per milliliter is less robust. For this video, we will use the Endocrine Society definitions. The age-specific problem. Skin's capacity to synthesize vitamin D in response to UVB radiation declines substantially with age. Studies measuring 7-dehydrocholesterol, the skin precursor to vitamin D, found that adults over 70 have approximately 75% less 7-dehydrocholesterol in the epidermis than young adults. This means that the same sun exposure that reliably produces adequate vitamin D synthesis in a 30-year-old produces dramatically less in a 65-year-old. This is not compensable by simply spending more time outdoors, because the skin depletion of precursor limits the rate of synthesis regardless of UVB exposure duration. It is one of the reasons dietary and supplemental sources become more important with age, not less. The dose response for sun exposure and vitamin D is also modified by a cluster of other factors simultaneously. Latitude determines whether UVB radiation reaches the Earth's surface at all. Above approximately 35 degrees north latitude, UVB-producing solar radiation is insufficient for vitamin D synthesis during winter months regardless of exposure time. This includes most of the U.S. north of Atlanta, all of the UK, Canada, and Northern Europe. Skin pigmentation substantially affects synthesis rate. Melanin absorbs UVB and reduces photosynthesis efficiency. Adults with darker skin produce significantly less vitamin D per unit of sun exposure than adults with lighter skin, at equivalent latitudes. Sunscreen use, if applied correctly, blocks nearly all UVB. Glass also blocks UVB entirely, meaning sitting by a window does not produce vitamin D synthesis. Time of day and season both matter considerably. UVB reaches the ground primarily when the sun is above approximately 45 degrees of elevation, which occurs only during the midday hours on most days in temperate climates. In winter, even at midday, UVB at higher latitudes is insufficient. The practical consequence is that the window for vitamin D synthesis from sun exposure in adults over 55 living above 35 degrees north latitude is substantially narrower than most people assume. A 2010 paper by Hollick and colleagues in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism estimated that for a fair-skinned adult in Boston, Massachusetts, 10 to 15 minutes of face, arms, and legs exposure at noon in June or July, without sunscreen, is sufficient for adequate synthesis on that day. In November in Boston, no amount of outdoor exposure is adequate. What does supplementation achieve? The vitamin D literature is extensive but also mixed at the trial level. The VITAL trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2019, randomized over 25,000 U.S. adults to vitamin D3 supplementation at 2,000 international units per day versus placebo over a median of 5 years. The study found no significant reduction in the primary outcomes of cardiovascular events or cancer incidence. However, in secondary analyses, there were signals suggesting reduced cancer mortality and reduced autoimmune disease incidence in the supplemented group. A 2022 analysis of the VITAL data by Hahn and colleagues found a significant reduction in autoimmune disease in the vitamin D group. The primary composite outcomes were not met, but the secondary signals from the largest vitamin D RCT available are not dismissible. Now for the critical analysis. The observational literature on vitamin D is vast but plagued by confounding. People with higher vitamin D levels tend to spend more time outdoors, have higher socioeconomic status, have better overall dietary quality, and exercise more, all of which independently predict better health outcomes. Separating the independent contribution of vitamin D from these correlated behaviors has proven difficult in observational data. Multiple large randomized trials, including VITAL and the VITA trial, have not shown the dramatic cardiovascular and cancer benefits that observational data suggested. This discordance between observational and randomized trial evidence is a recurring pattern in nutritional epidemiology. A second limitation involves the optimal 25-OH-D target. The bone health evidence supports a minimum of 20 nanograms per milliliter. The evidence for additional benefit from maintaining levels above 40 to 50 nanograms per milliliter is weaker and more speculative. Very high vitamin D levels, above 100 to 150 nanograms per milliliter, can cause toxicity through hypercalcemia. Supplementation at standard doses 1,000 to 4,000 international units per day does not reach toxic levels, but megadose supplementation without medical supervision does carry risk. This is an area where more is not uniformly better, and where individual laboratory monitoring is relevant. 3 takeaways. First, if you have not had a 25-hydroxyvitamin D measurement in the past 2 years, asking your physician for one is a routine, inexpensive, and widely available blood test. For adults over 55 in northern latitudes, a winter measurement is more informative than a summer one, because it captures your seasonal nadir. Knowing whether you are actually deficient, insufficient, or sufficient is more useful than assuming either direction. Second, the sun exposure dose response in adults over 55 is substantially less efficient than in younger adults, and is zero during winter above 35 degrees north latitude. If your physician determines that your 25-OH-D is low, supplementation with vitamin D3 is the most studied and reliable approach for correcting it. Vitamin D3, cholecalciferol, is more effective at raising 25-OH-D than vitamin D2, ergocalciferol, based on comparative bioavailability studies. The appropriate dose depends on your baseline level and overall health, which is why supplementation decisions should involve your physician rather than self-direction based on general population estimates. Third, vitamin K2 and calcium absorption interact with vitamin D in a way that is worth knowing. Vitamin D drives calcium absorption from the gut. Adequate matrix GLA protein activation, which requires vitamin K2, determines where that calcium ends up in bone or in arterial walls. This is why some researchers and preventive cardiology specialists consider vitamin D and vitamin K2 as a coordinated pair rather than independent supplements. Whether this pairing matters clinically at supplementation doses, and whether it is appropriate for your situation, is a question for a physician who has reviewed your cardiovascular and bone health picture comprehensively. To summarize, 40% of U.S. adults over 50 have 25-hydroxyvitamin D below 20 nanograms per milliliter. The skin's capacity for vitamin D synthesis declines by approximately 75% with age. Latitude, season, skin pigmentation, and time of day all modulate the dose response to sun exposure. The VITAL trial found no significant effect on primary cardiovascular or cancer outcomes from 2000 IU/day over 5 years, though secondary analyses showed signals for autoimmune disease reduction. Baseline measurement and physician-guided management are more reliable than self-directed supplementation. This is educational content, not medical advice. Consult your physician. Link to our free biomarker guide is in the description. New evidence reviews every Tuesday and Friday.